So I've recently rewatched the entirety of The Flash, watching all 5 seasons back to back for the first time ever, and now that I've done that, now that I've got maybe a new look, a fresh look at all of these episodes, I've come up with the 10 worst episodes of The Flash. Similarly, the top 10 best episodes of The Flash. I'll get to that in a later video, but for now, in this video, I'll be looking at the 10 worst episodes of The Flash, as well as some honorable mentions that technically did have the same score as maybe an episode 2 at the bottom of the list, but I don't really consider them to be as bad, so they're just going to be an honorable mentions. But these are the 10 worst episodes that The Flash has ever given us. Some of them are just okay, but some of them near the top of the list, like near number 1, are really, really bad. So with that in mind, let's begin the list.
Mom, I don't understand how I could do something like that to her.
Nora, you gotta snap out of this.
What I have to do is kill you.
So like I said, the first couple episodes in this list are not necessarily bad, and this one, episode 4 of season 5 of The Flash, is not really a bad episode per se, but it's not great either. It is, I think, the worst episode of season 5, which is actually pretty impressive how the worst episode of that season is only at number 10 on this list, considering season 5 is nowhere near my favorite season of The Flash at all. But this episode, I think, is not very good. The conflict between Iris and Nora is fine, but I don't think it's amazing or anything. And the villain of this episode, Spencer Young, aka Spin, is pretty horrible. The visuals of this episode, along with the visuals of the entirety of the season, are not very good, especially compared to every other season of the show, and that definitely does affect the quality of this episode, making this one of the worst episodes of the show, even though it's not even really bad. It's just maybe a little bit closer to mediocre or okay than anything else.
What should we call this brave new world that you've whipped up for us? I was thinking Flashpoint.
Now, just like Newsflash, this episode is not necessarily a bad one, it's just that it's so incredibly disappointing. I think if this was an original idea, like say the Flashpoint storyline never existed, and this Barry going back to save his mom and not creating an alternate timeline, that was an original idea, I probably would have liked this episode a lot more than I did, and I probably would have liked the consequences of the episode in the whole season a lot more than I did. But the fact that this is supposed to be an adaptation, a loose adaptation, but an adaptation nonetheless of Flashpoint, probably the most iconic Flash storyline, and definitely, in my opinion, the best one, that's incredibly disappointing because the world that Barry created was not very interesting. It was a very boring look at an alternate reality, and also the fact that it only lasted 1 episode, that was pretty stupid, and there was a lot of stupid moments in this episode. Again, not really a bad episode, but certainly I think the most disappointing episode of the show, and the fact that an episode called Flashpoint is even on the top 10 worst episodes of the Flash list, that's something that they really, really did wrong.
Good luck getting him out.
Barry!
I'm stuck in a mirror. What are you doing?
Do these pants make my butt look big?
Near the middle of season 3 around, The Flash has had so many boring episodes over and over again. The Flashpoint episode was more disappointing than anything, not necessarily boring. Episode 2 was fine, but it was episodes 3, 4, and 5, as well as a lot of 6, but I'm not counting that. That's definitely not a bad episode at all, but it was 3, 4, and 5, which actually you will find all 3 of those episodes on this list that were just so damn boring, and that was maybe the lowest point for The Flash ever, or the lowest continuous point for The Flash, because these 3 episodes were so boring. This one was definitely the best out of those 3, but it certainly wasn't good. While the Jessica Quick storyline wasn't terrible, it wasn't great either, it just wasn't terrible, and I was a little bit interested in Killer Frost storyline. The fact that it was in that boring period, and also the fact that Mirror Master is definitely one of the more disappointing villains on the show, as he could have been so much more than he was. Similarly, Top, less disappointing, more just overall terrible. This episode definitely was a part of the show that just didn't work at all. It was so boring, and while this episode was the best out of those episodes, that isn't really saying much.
Burp yourself down like Charlie Bucket.
I swear off.
All right, where is she?
Look and fly, Flash! Ralph,
I know what I'm doing.
he's gonna fall to his death.
This episode was pretty damn bad. It does have one thing going for it, and that's the back and forth between Barry and Ralph, especially with Ralph explaining to Barry why he was joking around and why that side of him exists. That definitely was not bad at all, but literally everything else in this episode, except for maybe the visuals, just like the rest of the season, everything else was really, really, really bad. Noel, I don't even remember her name, but Noel, one of the worst villains on the show ever. Her powers weren't terrible, but the actress, the writing for the character, the way she acted, it was not very good, and I'm glad she ended up being a villain who only appeared in a single episode. But also the storyline, and this is maybe the biggest problem with the episode, the storyline with Cisco and Breacher and Caitlin was god awful. It was so bad that it genuinely made me dislike Cisco for this episode, because he just acted in a way that human beings just don't act. How he didn't tell Breacher about his problem, and the storyline that happened in this episode was so manufactured, and I genuinely hated it. Like I said, to the point that it genuinely made me dislike Cisco, which I didn't think that was possible, but that did happen, so I really don't like this episode at all.
As to why I'm here.
There's something about him.
Come on, you can't just go through his stuff.
Is trust not something that you have on this earth?
Another episode that took place during that 3-episode kind of break from interest that The Flash had in episodes 3 to 5 of The Flash Season 3, and this one was even worse than episode 5, as it didn't have the Jesse Quick storyline and the Caitlin storyline that were both pretty good, or at least not terrible. In episode 5, nothing with Jesse Quick, it was only with Killer Frost, which wasn't great, but also wasn't bad either, as it was a thing that I was definitely interested in. But the main storyline with this holographic monster that was created by this unnamed teenage boy, that was really bad, not to mention that the CGI going for the monster was actually pretty great, which is a shame because it's just a random monster that really could have went to some DC character they maybe could have used for one episode, or maybe an extra King Shark or Gorilla Grodd episode, which maybe would have broken up the monotony of these 3 episodes, how boring they were. It really would have broken up. There was just this one big CGI episode with King Shark or Gorilla Grodd. Instead, it went to this random monster, which really, really sucked, and this episode overall was not very good.
It's my turn to do what you've been doing.
Alright, I'll monitor from here then. Other monitor. Wow, that's super annoying.
Iris was a pretty bad character in Season 4, not really in Seasons 1 to 3 or even in 5, it was really just in Season 4 where she was a bad character, so the fact that she became the Flash, she became technically the main character of an episode, could not have come at a worse time, as in Season 4, she was heavily disliked, so that made this episode extremely controversial. That doesn't even address the fact that this episode was technically filler, other than introducing a Bus Matter, which is really just a villain of the week that they cleverly integrated into the season-long storyline. This episode has nothing to do with anything, it's completely filler, and it adds to nothing, not to mention, again, the villain Jacob Birch, aka, or later would be named the Hotness, was pretty terrible. The actor was really bad, he was really, really over the top, and while I think the visuals of this episode, similarly to the rest of the season, are pretty good, it doesn't help this episode at all, as it is one of the worst episodes of the show, and in the top 5.
Yeah, pretty cool, right?
We're looking for a meta with super strength.
My daughter, Jesse Quick.
Guys, this thing's coming down.
Run, Jesse.
Another episode from the beginning of Season 3, or near the beginning, like I said, episodes 3 to 5 are all on this list, and while they did get kind of, as you see on this list, get better with each episode, that doesn't really mean much, as this episode, as well as the other 2, are very, very bad, and some of the worst of the show, or at least pretty bad. This episode is certainly closer to very bad, as while Jesse Quick's storyline in this episode is certainly okay, the rest of it is really, really bad. Visually, I don't think this episode is very good. Magenta is a pretty terrible villain who I just don't think helped the episode at all. So overall, the 3rd episode of Season 3 is the worst episode of the season, and definitely started the part of the season, the 3-episode arc of the season, that was one of like the worst parts of the show ever, and this was actually the worst of those episodes.
Racing past them, but they have never seen the Flash. Central City believes in the Flash. So do I.
Season 2 of The Flash is a genuinely great season, definitely one of the best of the Arrowverse, but for some reason, some way, the first episode is really bad, and it just is like so much worse than the rest of the season. It's insane. For one, I do not like at all the resolution to the cliffhanger of Season 1, as they now say that Ronnie just died out of nowhere, which number one was, it made his superhero career way too short, and number two, I just don't think they should have killed him off at all, and they just did it, the way they did it just came out of nowhere. Similarly, this episode also had some pretty terrible fight scenes, and Adam Smasher, who in the comics is a member of the Justice Society of America and a superhero, was turned into a villain, but not only that, a one-off villain who was pretty bad. So all in all, in spite of the fact that the ending where Jay Garrick, who turned out to be Zoom, showed up was pretty awesome, that was pretty cool, this episode I think was so much worse than the rest of Season 2, it's alarming, and certainly one of my least favorite episodes of The Flash.
We need your help.
No killing. That was not a stipulation. Fine, it is time-consuming to remove blood from metal.
This episode was so bad, and it was such a low point for the season, and not the lowest point, but certainly a low point, as Amina Black is such a terrible character, definitely I think the worst character on the show ever, as she is solely responsible for why this episode is so bad, and spoiler alert, she's also a part of the number one worst episode of the show ever, but I'll get to that soon. This episode, Amina Black is probably even worse than she is in that other episode, as she is just so aggravating. I hate everything about this character. I talked about it more in detail in my actual ranking for all the episodes of Season 4. You can check that out in the top right corner of this video, but I just hate Amina Black, especially in this episode. It doesn't help things that Norvok is in this episode. He's terrible. It also doesn't help things that the Council of Harrisons are in this episode, and they're very much focused on in this episode, as although they're pretty entertaining and pretty damn funny, they're also really stupid, and I just can't take them or the show seriously whenever they are on screen. So overall, this is one of the worst episodes of the show ever, and actually the second worst episode so far. Hopefully that will stay that way. Hopefully there'll never be an episode ever as bad as this one going forward, but there is one episode that is way worse than this one, and so much worse than any other episode on the show. It feels like it was basically written by different people.
How are we gonna stop that guy?
The suit will only absorb one of Gray's punches. Anything more than that, you'll be like a piñata.
Please. Guys, the suit's freaking out.
Get it off!
I can't get it off. What the hell does he need a mask for, Cisco?
He runs on water. It seemed like a smart idea at the time. Who do you think's his next victim?
You kidnapped Barry.
Let's go save the Flash.
Take off your pants, not your eye! Have we heard from the guys yet?
What did you just do?
I swing got peanuts from a bar.
Girls' Night Out is a terrible, god-awful episode. While drunk Barry is hilarious, I'll give this episode that, and that's something I will admit about this episode. Barry being drunk is just so funny. Everything else in this episode is terrible. Go figure that Felicity Smoke is in the worst episode of the show ever. I mean, obviously says something about the character, but the fact that she went to Iris, who they never really became friends, she went to her bachelorette party, while Oliver, it doesn't seem like he was invited to Barry's bachelor party, while they did become friends, and they were friends. That really bothers me, but that is definitely the least terrible thing about this episode, as there's just so many terrible things. Obviously, the hashtag feminism, Joni, her whole storyline, this episode genuinely made me dislike her as a character. Amina Black is the worst, not as bad as in Harry and Harrison's, but still pretty terrible. This is her second worst episode of the show in terms of her as a character. The fact that Iris, Cecile, and Felicity try to take down Amina by themselves is just so stupid, and the forced relationship between Iris and Caitlin, that also, the forced friendship between them, that was not very good. It was really just so that Caitlin would be the maid of honor at Iris's wedding in a couple episodes. So while there are some complaints about this episode that are more mild than others, and some things are better than others, this episode just is definitely by far the worst episode of the show ever, and that's something that IMDb, the voters of IMDb, do agree with, as this episode is by far not by far, actually it's pretty close with Run Iris Run, but it is definitely the lowest rated episode of this show ever, and I think the Arrowverse ever, so that definitely is pretty terrible. So anyway, let me know in the comments down below what your ranking is for the top 10 worst episodes of The Flash ever, and do you agree with mine? At least let me know in the comments down below what is your least favorite, because I think it's either between Girls Night Out or Run Iris Run, which is the two least popular episodes of the show ever. So let me know in the comments down below which one you like least, and just what your worst episode or your least favorite episode is overall. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned because I will post my video going over the top 10 best episodes of The Flash ever, which will obviously be a lot more positive, and I probably will enjoy making that video just a little bit more than this one.